Welcome to the Army and Battle section of my Dwarf guide. In this section we will go over the entire Dwarf roster, covering all the units' pros and cons, as well as compositions and formations for battle. Disclaimer: this guide is based on my personal experiences and opinions and is by no means a definitive way to play the Dwarves and Mortal Empires. If you have a different strategy or want to add something to mine, please leave a comment down below. Now if that's out of the way, let's get into the video. The Dwarf armies are focused on quality over quantity, so while your armies will be more expensive than most other factions, the individual units will pull their weight accordingly. They have a particularly strong roster of ranged and artillery units, which makes them a very good turtling faction, letting the enemy come to them rather than charging ahead. This is reinforced by their speed, which is, with the exception of a few units, incredibly slow. The combination of this and the strong leadership makes them excellent at pure frontline fights with little use of flanking. They are also an excellent siege faction, both in attack and defence, as a strong armour and leadership means they can hold the walls for a massive amount of time whilst your range units chip away at attackers. And the excellent artillery can also break down gates and walls in a matter of shot, getting you inside to fight much sooner than usual. It's also worth noting that they have no cavalry of their own, but they do have great charge resistance on most units, meaning that enemy cavalry flanks aren't going to hit you too hard unless it's on undefended artillery. They also have a resistance to magic on all units, even though they have no spells available themselves. Okay, now we've covered all that, let's get into the roster. First up from the melee infantry are the miners, which is a fitting name as they have a minor impact on your battles to say the least. While they do have armour piercing damage in the early game, I noticed that in battles they'd almost always lose all of their unit fighting even basic infantry, which caused major slowdowns in the early game when I'm sat waiting for them to replenish. That being said, I did bring a couple of them with me in the very early game so that I could bring them to swarm enemy lords with armour piercing damage, but as soon as I unlocked great weapon warriors, I replaced them as they didn't even compare. In battles, I like to keep them on the inside of my front lines, so that they are protected from charges and can easily pick armoured targets in the initial charge. They come in two variations, standard and blasting charges. The only difference is that blasting charge miners have blasting charges. These are basically an explosive throwable that they use before charging into melee that can cause some good damage and leadership penalties, but I still don't think this earns them a place in armies as they just don't seem to last. Dwarf warriors are up next, and they are the meat of your early game army. They are an armoured and shielded unit, so can take a good amount of punishment from both melee and ranged, making them great for holding the front lines for a huge amount of time. While they won't be getting a massive amount of kills in battle, they will make it very easy for your ranged units to fire over their heads and break the enemy in no time. I'd recommend taking 2 to 4 of them in the early game and keeping them on the flanks of your front lines so that they can absorb any cav charges without major damage. They come in 2 varieties, standard and great weapons. Choosing great weapons gives them armor piercing damage at the cost of losing their shields, which I believe is totally worth it as it ups their damage considerably and allows them to break through the front lines with ease. Longbeards are basically old man warriors with improvements to a bunch of stats. They have the Old Grumblers attribute, which gives them a leadership aura because of their great age, superior courage, and long facial hair. I choose to replace my Dwarf warriors with these guys as soon as I can, as the stat differences and leadership aura make them so much more valuable in battle, both as individual units and for buffing the rest of the lines. They will have similar placement in the formation to warriors as they can absorb charges from the flanks without too much trouble. Again, they come in 2 varieties, standard and great weapons. As usual, great weapons grant armour piercing damage at the cost of losing their shields, and I totally recommend going for great weapons as soon as you can to make them more effective against heavily armoured targets. Slayers are the giant bane of the Dwarf roster. While they lack armour, they make up for this by having great damage, especially against anything larger than a man. They're also pretty fast for dwarves, so are good for getting around the front lines or chasing some slower large units. They are also equipped with 2 whirling axes that allow them to deflect missiles shot at them, giving them some minor protection from ranged attacks. They also have the death blow attribute, meaning that getting closer to death only makes them fight harder, and once they do fall, they get off one last attack before dying completely. They come in 2 variations, standard and giant slayers. Giant slayers have armour piercing damage, so are better for focusing the huge units that enemies might bring, whereas standard slayers are better suited for smaller cavalry units. Either of them are a great addition to your armies once you unlock them. But I generally take giant slayers into the endgame with me as the armour piercing damage makes a lot of difference. I take a couple of them with me into battle and use them to cover my ranged units from cavalry or to focus down any large units in the front lines. Hammerers are the elite damage dealing infantry of the Dwarfs. They are heavily armoured but unshielded, so while they can take a lot of punishment in battle, they are vulnerable to gradual skirmishing damage. They also inflict armour piercing damage, although I'm not exactly sure how, as hammers don't seem to pierce armour. This means they can go up against even the toughest infantry and deal a lot of damage even if they don't come out on top. I like to take 2 of these guys with 2 slayers and 2 Ein Breakers to keep things balanced. I put hammers in the middle of my front lines so that they can take on anything that comes their way and sometimes even push a hole in the enemy lines. Ein Breakers are the final melee infantry unit the dwarves bring, and they are pretty grey at everything. They're armoured and shielded, so can take a ton of punishment from melee and ranged. They also have charge defense against all, so can absorb cavalry charges with minimal hits to health and leadership. They also come to battle with a special ranged weapon that can be used to disrupt enemy formations and cause massive damage before charging into melee. They're basically what you'd get if you had blasting charge miners and actually made them viable. As I said before, I take 2 of them into the endgame and I choose to put them on the flanks so that they can absorb any flanking charges with ease. It's worth getting them to use all of their ammo before getting locked in melee, as it does a good amount of damage, and besides, it looks pretty cool too. Kicking things off for the ranged infantry are the Rangers. They come with vanguard deployment, so can get shots off from the start of the battle if you place them ahead of your main army. They also have stalk, so can sneak up on the enemy if you move them correctly. To stop things off, they're also quite fast, so are good for getting a flanking angle on the front lines and causing some good damage. All this combined makes them good for placing in a hidden location and bringing them out to attack the backs of unsuspecting enemies once the front lines are established. They're a good alternative to Corylus, as they are fairly similar stats wise but lack the same defense, so aren't great if they get caught by a flank and have to go into melee. If I'm taking then, I probably wouldn't go for just them as my range units, as they're unlocked at a similar time to Thunderers, so I'd say 3 of each would work well, so you have some armor piercing damage. If you're using them to flank, then I place them in some trees or whatever else you can hide them in, but if not, I initially place them at the head of my front lines so that they can get some shots off before melee begins. Once it does, then I use them to either fire over your troops' heads or to get around and fire into the backs of the enemies. Corylus are up next, and these guys will be the bread and butter of your early game ranged infantry. They have excellent range, though nothing compared to the High Elves link in the card, so can get lots of shots off before the enemy even gets to you. They're also armoured and shielded, so can take quite a bit of damage themselves from melee and ranged. Speaking of melee, they can actually do pretty well so long as they're against nothing too elite. Since they are the first ranged unit you unlock, I'd recommend bringing up to 6 of them in the early game, as I like to keep a balance of ranged to melee units. Once you unlock Thunderers, I take 3 of each to get a nice balance between arc damage and armor piercing damage. That reminds me, Corylus and Rangers are both arced units, meaning when they fire, their projectiles travel in an arc to their targets rather than a straight line. This can be a good and a bad thing, as they can fire over the heads of your units, but their projectiles don't travel as fast or hard, meaning less damage and accuracy to moving targets. Back to Corylus. There are 2 variations, standard and great weapons. Taking great weapons gives them armor piercing damage in melee at the cost of dropping their shields. It's very situational when deciding which to take, but if you can protect them really well from melee, take shields. If not, take great weapons, as the armor piercing will let them take out melee attackers faster and get back to shooting. In battle, I like to place them ahead of my melee troops to get off some initial volleys before melee begins. Once it does, I place them either behind or on the flanks of the front lines so that I can get some shots off with minimal friendly fire. Rangers with great weapons are an interesting addition to the ranged roster, so interesting that I gave them a separate section of their own from normal Rangers. They're a close quarters weaponry unit, meaning that their range attacks have a much shorter range but do much more damage than normal. They have armor piercing for both ranged and in melee, so don't be afraid to send them against some mid-tier troops if your front lines need the support. They also come with vanguard deployment and stalk, as well as being fast. This means you can place them in a hidden location and have them attack the enemy backs with either melee or ranged to break their morale and drain their health. If I'm taking them, I'd only take 2 or 3 maximum, and either use them to get some early shots off from the front, or keep them hidden until the lines are established. Thunderers are up next, and they are the first direct fire unit we have. They can technically fire over ally heads, but only at great range, as once the enemy gets too close, they must fire in a straight line to hit. This means that you need to use them in a flanking position to shoot the sides or backs of enemies to ensure you get the most kills and least friendly fire. They also have armor piercing missiles, so are great for chipping away at heavily armoured units before they get into melee. They are armoured and shielded, so can take plenty of damage in both melee and ranged before they start to rout. They are also decent in melee, so will hold their own against any low tier units that flank them. I take 3 of them with me from the moment I unlock them until I replace them with Trollhammer torpedoes, as they are a great combo with spread out and less armor piercing arc units. I like to do the usual and have them up front to begin with before moving them back and to the flanks once melee has begun. Buckman's Rangers are the last of the bolt firers, and they're basically a good mid-ground between Corylus and Rangers. They have all the same attributes as regular rangers, but they also get charge defense against large. This makes them much better at absorbing any cavalry charges the enemy throws at you, without losing too much health or leadership. I choose to take them into the near end game alongside 3 Thunderers to add some diversity to the damage I'm putting out, and also to the strategies I employ. As mentioned in the Ranger section, I would either use them to get shots off from the front of and behind the front lines, or to attack from an unexpected location. Iron Drakes are up, and they are a damn good unit. They fire literal torrents of fire and are excellent at taking out big clumps of infantry. They do fire in a very shallow arc, so while they can fire over heads, they're much more effective when using a flanking angle or elevated position. One of my favourite things to do is to get them onto the enemy walls when I'm attacking and have them rain fire onto the enemies below. They're an armoured unit, so take quite a bit of punishment, but they aren't the best in melee, so it's best to keep them mildly protected if you can. I like to replace my arc units with them as soon as I can, as they are just machines at taking out any and all infantry regardless of the tier. I employ the usual strategy at putting them ahead of my front lines before moving them behind and to the sides for flanking shots. Be aware that even if you do flank, the fire and explosions will still cause some friendly fire, so just reduce it as much as you can. Finally, we come to the Trollhammer Torpedo Ein Drakes. They are again so different that they deserve their own segment. Rather than flamethrowers, they're equipped with Trollhammer torpedoes, which deal armor-piercing explosive damage with a bonus to large targets. This makes them great at taking out cavalry units, giants, and, you guessed it, trolls. They do, however, have a very slow rate of fire, so tend to have bursts of damage with breaks in between to reload. Like the Iron Drakes, they're armoured, so can take a bit of punishment, but are again not best left in melee. I like to replace my Thunderers with these guys, as the anti-large and explosive damage makes a lot of difference in your battles. I use the usual strategy that I've said like 20 times by now, so I'm not going to repeat myself, but you get the idea. Onto the War Machines, and all 3 are variations of the same unit, so I'll cover what they all do before going into the differences. They are all flying units, so are exceptionally fast, so are great for going out and harassing the enemy before they even get close to you. They are all armoured, so can take quite a bit of punishment, but aren't the best if they get attacked by other flying units, as they have pretty pitiful melee stats. They all have the ability to drop bombs of varying severity and number, and are all primarily ranged units. The base Gyrocopter is an anti-infantry unit, so is great for firing into and bombing big clumps of enemies. If there are no big clumps, then a good tactic is to wait until the front lines are made, and then route them to go over the enemy's side of the melee and spam the bombs. It does suffer from poor accuracy, but apart from that, it's a great unit to get as soon as you can. I'd take one of these until I unlock the Gyro Bomber, which is better in a few ways. It fires armor-piercing missiles, so is great for attacking any tough units on the enemy team. It also carries more bombs, so while the unit size is just 1 as opposed to 3, it has significantly more firepower and can make some really devastating runs. Finally, we come to the Brimstone Gun Gyrocopter, which is an anti-large unit, so is great for harassing giants and trolls before they can reach your men, or to keep them running when they break. Other than the anti-large thing, they're basically the same as a standard gyrocopter, but with better accuracy, and I like to bring one of them, alongside the Gyro Bomber, into the endgame with me. The strat for using them is fairly straightforward: send them to attack whatever they're effective against, whilst avoiding being shot at too much or being attacked by air. Once lines are established, get them behind the enemy so that they can shoot into their backs with less risk of friendly fire. Finally, we come to my favourite category, artillery, and the Dwarfs have some of the best in the game. First off is the Bolt Thrower, and already it's pretty exciting. It fires anti-large armor-piercing bolts that can do some serious damage to everything bigger than a man, and you can unlock them extremely early in the game. I like to use them to focus any large units the enemies bring, and if they don't bring any, then I just target the Lords and Heroes, as the armor-piercing damage does quite a lot of damage if you get a hit. I like to bring 2 of them with me as soon as I can, and they last me until the mid-game when they get replaced by cannons. Still, while you have them, they are going to be really great. It's also worth noting they fire in a very shallow arc, so aren't going to be able to get many shots off when the front lines are established, so make sure you use them well before this. The Grudge Thrower is next, and this unit has given me so much joy whilst playing the campaign. It's just a basic catapult, but you can get some serious damage dealt if they land correctly and can even break entire units before they get to you. They're armor piercing, so can be directed at even the toughest units and still cause some serious damage. They're also an anti-infantry, so are experts at taking out big clumps of infantry that are charging your way. Again, they are available from very early on in the game, and I kept them right through until the end when they got replaced by flame cannons, but they could easily be taken into the endgame if you wanted. The strategy is fairly straightforward: find the toughest infantry you can and harass them until they get into melee. Once the front lines are made, aim at targets that aren't too close to your men to minimise the friendly fire. Since they are arced units, you can get away with some slight firing overheads, but you run the risk of severe friendly fire if the target is close. Cannons are up next, and as I said before, they replace my bolt throwers ASAP, so perform pretty similarly with one difference. Cannons have a massive range compared to bolt throwers, meaning they can get off way more shots pre-melee and can shatter entire units before they even see melee. They also do a bit more damage, so are excellent for sniping any large or armoured units the enemies bring. They do fire in a fairly shallow arc, so once the units are in melee, they're going to struggle to get many shots off at all, so make sure you get lots of use out of them pre-melee while you can. Since they're replacing bolt throwers, the composition and strat are basically the same, so I won't repeat it. Organ guns are next, and they're basically like a bunch of smaller cannons rolled into one. They fire lots of armour-piercing missiles in rapid bursts, so are great for focusing tough infantry or for really bullying a giant or set of trolls. Even though they lack the anti-large damage that cannons have, I choose to take them with me into the endgame as they just have so much more versatility and damage output that it makes up for the lack of bonesers, but you could bring either and do just as well. Again, they have a shallow firing arc, so are best used before the melee, but can still be used at a risk to your men once they're fighting. They share the same composition and a similar strategy, so again, I won't repeat myself. Finally, we come to the flame cannon, and this is possibly one of my favourite pieces of artillery in the game, and this game has Dinosaur Artillery. It's an anti-infantry unit that fires flaming cannonballs into the enemy lines that explode in fiery glory. They're near unmatched at tearing oncoming infantry to pieces and can cause serious damage to pretty much any infantry in the game. Unfortunately, they have a very shallow firing arc, meaning that once front lines are made, it's very hard to get any shots off on infantry unless you get a very good angle. No matter what you do, you will get some friendly fire as explosions will spread to your men even if you fire directly into enemy backs. All in all though, it's a great unit to take, and I take 2 of these to replace my grudge throwers into the endgame. Now onto the regiments of renown. I'll list off each unit, what they're a regiment of, and what differences they bring. Ekrund miners are blasting charge miners and come with stat improvements for leadership, melee attack and defense, charge bonus, ammunition, and missile damage. They also gain the frenzy trait, meaning they fight extra hard when their leadership drops below 50. Warriors of Dragonfire Pass are dwarf warriors and come with stat improvements for leadership and melee attack and defense. They also gain the anti-infantry trait, so will perform even better in the front lines. The Grumbling Guard are Longbeards with great weapons, and come with stat improvements for leadership and melee attack and defense. They also gain the Old Grumbler ability, which gives them and nearby allies plus 9% vigor. Dragonback Slayers are Slayers, and come with stat improvements for melee attack and defense. They gain a 20% physical resistance, charge defense against large foes, 22% flame resistance, and have attacks imbued with a flammable effect. Peak Gate Guard are Hammerers, and come with stat improvements for leadership and melee attack and defense. They also gain armor sundering attacks and an immunity to psychology. Norgrimling's Ein Breakers are an Ein Breakers unit, and come with stat improvements for leadership, melee attack and defense, health, and missile damage. They gain Vanguard deployment and are immune to psychology. Ulthar's Raiders are a great weapons rangers unit and come with stat improvements for leadership, melee attack and defense, and missile damage. They also have the ability Marked by Ulthar. The Skolder Guard are an Iron Drakes unit and come with stat improvements for leadership, melee attack and defense, and range. They lose some overall damage, but gain more armor piercing damage, and they also gain plus 20% physical resistance. The Skyhammer is a gyro bomber unit and comes with stat improvements for leadership, melee attack and defense, and missile damage. They also have improved bombs and drop more of them at once, so are excellent for obliterating entire units of infantry. Finally, we have the Goblobber, which is a grudge thrower unit and comes with stat improvements for leadership, melee attack and defense, and range. They also have the attribute Goblin Mongrel, which attaches a goblin prisoner to the boulder and causes the target to take a leadership penalty for each hit. Finally, we come to a new segment, which is my ideal composition and formation for the endgame campaign. I take 2 Hammerers, 2 Iron Breakers, and 2 Giant Slayers and have them organised as shown. I then take 3 Iron Drakes and 2 Trollhammer Iron Drakes and line them up in front of my melee lines for now with skirmish off. I take 2 Flame Cannons and 2 Organ Guns and have them as shown behind my melee lines, so they can get lots of shots off while still being protected from an early charge. I take a Brimstone Gyrocopter and a Gyro Bomber and place them at my flanks so that they can go off and attack whatever targets I see as soon as the battle begins. Finally, I bring a Standard Lord, a Runesmith, and a Master Engineer, as this gets me the best balance of melee for Lord duels, magical support from runes, and range snipes from the Engineers. Now to see how this performs in battle, I'll pass over to live recording me. Miles?
Thanks, Miles. Right, we're just going to go through this in nice little slow motion as we start. Of course, I am basically turtling, but what I am doing is giving these guys targets as soon as they get into range, so we're going to see here in a little while once guys get into range. Right, It's already firing those, that's totally fine. What I'm doing is, see right there, I just targeted all my armor piercing to focus to large units because they have quite a lot of armor, especially this giant spider, so you really want to chip those down from the start. Plus, I'm pretty sure that's a lord, isn't it? One of them is a lord. No, this one's a lord. Anyway. And the flame cannons, I'm going to do the same once they get just about into range. I'm going to direct these to the Black Orcs that are back here. So I'm just going to speed that up just a little bit until they, yep, there they go. Start firing. And you see there, they are just, that Orc boy's just got like a large portion of his health taken away immediately from like those flame cannons. They are so good. Right, I've also moved up the Gyrocopter Brimstone to attack this, and the Gyro Bomber is moving up to attack the Black Orcs. And I'm going to save the bombs for now because there's not really much point using them while they're all like spaced out like this. You want to wait for them to get clumped up. Now they are making a charge here. I'm pretty sure I don't counter this in time, and they do get a charge from the Ein Breakers. So you see there, I tried to move up the Ein Breakers and the Slayers, but I'm a little bit too slow, and the Ein Breakers can use a bit of their ammo there. So the Ein Drakes kind of get locked up. I could have managed that better, but that's just how it is in these things. Right, see, I've moved back all my ranged units now to get behind the front lines, and I'm holding off these squigs with my hammers, which aren't the best against large, but you know, they've got good damage and their armor piercing, so that's great. And I'm charging my giant slayers here to attack the lord, which, you know, the anti-large is going to do pretty well. Look, his health is already just absolutely plummeting. That is fantastic. Hammers are also here, getting ready to go into whatever brings. Now they're making a charge on this side. I'm just shooting at that with my Ein Drakes. Ein Drakes are good against pretty much anything, to be honest. I know they say that they're in anti-infantry, but they can do well against anything. Now they did manage to get some Orc Boy big uns behind me, but like your artillery, even your artillery can defend themselves pretty well. I mean, look, they're like half health, less than half leadership. We're doing all right. Right, we just did a nice little bombing run there. That looks great. How's the Gyro Bomber doing? Fantastic. Great shots there by the cannon. What you really want to do is you don't want to let enemies retreat and then come back. So if you can, when units are broken like this, you want to keep firing them until they shatter completely, and then you know, like, they're never coming back. Again, Ein Drake's just doing God's work, getting some great shots on the Goblin Wolf Archers over there. What else we got going on? Oh yeah, for some reason this unit of Giant Slayers like chased a unit off the map, so I just send them in against Orc War Boss, just, you know, just so I have a little bit of a... Well, so they're doing some basic because they're over there. I ain't quite done that yet. There they go. Right, the Giant here is so nearly dead. He has taken out quite a few units himself, but that's just how they are. Like, even if you got anti-large going against them, they are just that good. We're also sending my Runesmith here to... Not sure where he's going, actually. He's just doing his thing. And I noticed that this boss, he's not taking nearly as much damage as I think, and they've got 3 units here against my 1 unit, so I really want to get some spot over here. So what I start doing eventually is I'm pretty sure I start tagging all my artillery onto this lord, because he's just going to destroy my lord, who, you know, has no mounts, pretty quickly if we don't do something about him. Their artillery is still just coming down. I really should have taken a Gyro Bomber over there to take care of that. Right, how are we doing? Right, the Runesmith currently engaged with the Orc Boy Biggins. That's no worries, he can totally just handle that himself. I mean, he's getting a little bit swarmed, but, you know, he'll be alright for now. Giant Slayers over here. For some reason, they're sending the Spider against it, which was a terrible idea, because he can just completely destroy them. Ein Drakes have just rallied. Have I noticed yet? Because I should really be using them to shoot all this. No, I haven't noticed. There we go. Just use my Engineer's ability, just to give him a little bit more accuracy and reload damage. Reload damage? Yes, that's the thing. Okie doke, the Giant Slayers have taken out their units. The Ein Drakes, here we go, the mass rout happens. And I believe that is a victory in 4 minutes with that comp. So, back to you, Miles. That concludes this section of the guide on the Dwarf Armies. Next time we'll cover the Lords and Heroes, and what they can do for you in both campaign and on the battlefield. Thanks for watching this section of my Dwarf guide. If you want to check out the other parts, there's a link in the card and in the description for a playlist to the series. Don't forget to vote on the poll for the next race you want me to make a guide for, which is linked in the description and the comments. If you enjoyed this video any time, please consider leaving it a like, as it really does help out a lot. And if you want to see more of this type of video, maybe click that subscribe button so you can stay up to date. After all, it is free. For now though, I was COLONELDAMNEDERS, and I'll see you next turn.